It's getting harder and harder to simply live in Canada. Look at the prices of housing, food, and different services. Look at how pessimistic Canadians are about their future. How did this happen in a country with such natural resources, a strong economy, and with Canada being one of the priority countries for migrants? Let's start with a well-known problem with Canadian housing. The mandate of the central bank, the Bank of Canada, is to conduct monetary policy that preserves the value of money by keeping inflation low and stable. Apparently, the Bank of Canada's approach has kept overall inflation since 2000 at no more than 5%, except when it reached 8% in June 2022, while real estate prices have been rising inexorably with a few exceptions. The Canadian housing market is also not like the US market, despite the close economic ties between the two countries. The 2008 crisis did not crash Canadian prices as hard as the US prices. And while it took the US market almost 10 years to reach its previous peak, Canadian market recovered in just 2 years. For a long time, interest rates in Canada were very low, which allowed more people to take out more loans because money was cheaper for people. Affordable credit stimulated the ability to make large purchases as well as investments. Naturally, this allowed people to actively buy real estate, among other things. This in turn, due to increased demand, contributed to price growth. Also, a significant factor in price growth is the lack of supply in the real estate market with a growing population, and the population is growing rapidly due to the large number of migrants. In the last 2 years, Canada has registered about 1 million immigrants, and the total population is already over 40 million. Prices have doubled since 2010 and peak in 2022 during the pandemic. Here are the median prices of housing in Victoria, Toronto, and Vancouver. At the same time, the average salary in Canada is just over $60,000. Taking into account that vacancy rates in Canada's rental market hit a record low of 1.5%, you can imagine how difficult it is to rent a house. But what if you look at grocery stores, for example? There's a problem here, too. Inflation growth reached 10% in 2022, but here we cannot blame only the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which influenced the rise in prices for both energy and food. The trend of accelerating inflation can be seen as early as 2021. Telecom prices are no better. According to various sources, Canadians pay even more than in the US for mobile internet, for example. On the contrary, Canadians pay less for common internet than in the USA, but 10 times more than in some European countries. It is sometimes cheaper to fly by air to Europe or Asia than to fly from one place in Canada to another. What is the reason? It is very easy to blame everything on the monopolization of the market, but the reality is not so clear-cut. Canada's economy has historically been marked by notable monopolies, thanks to its vast geographical expanse and relatively sparse population. Hudson's Bay Company and Canadian Pacific Railway Company played significant roles in the country's development. This largely happened out of concern that domestic companies would be overwhelmed by American competitors unless they grew significantly. Recent trends indicate this phenomenon is not only persisting, but intensifying. Royal Bank of Canada, TD Bank, Scotiabank, the Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and National Bank control 90% of the banking industry. Rogers, Bell, and TELUS account for 88.7% of the telecommunications market. Air Canada and WestJet command over 85% the airline industry. And Sobeys, Loblaws, Metro, Costco, and Walmart command over 60% of the grocery market. The reason for monopolies in Canada is not just judges and political leadership, but one of the weakest antitrust laws in the world. Enacted in 1986, Canada's Competition Act has several important flaws that make it tough to use. Unlike the American antitrust laws, the Canadian law explicitly allowed what is known as an efficiencies defense, meaning that firms can merge to monopoly if they can show that any harms are outweighed by projected cost savings. There was also no private right of action, meaning all cases would have to be brought by the government. And cases are heard in the big law-dominated competition tribunal. Why did Canadians pass such a law? It was written, as many of Canadian laws are, in the shadow of the United States and its far larger firms. The hope at the time was that Canadian monopolists, with enough market power, could hold off their more brash American counterparts. A lot of countries just have 2 or 3 major national mobile network operators providing service the same or similar to Canada. However, there are some differences in the role of mobile virtual network operators, also called resellers, which are more prominent in some other other countries. The virtual refers to a company that rents or buys use of other operators' spectrum and equipment instead of owning towers. There are no purely wireless companies in Canada. In 2021, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission established a policy forcing the large companies to share access to their networks, which would allow regional carriers to act as MVNOs, with the goal of boosting wireless competition. However, under the CRTC's rules, only companies owning a network can operate as MVNOs. They must have their own spectrum license, and they must plan to build a network in any new region they want to operate in within 7 years. In essence, Canada continues to prioritize the need for physical infrastructure, which is a deterrent to creating a major competitor to the big three telephone companies. Why are airline flights so expensive in Canada? Plane tickets are expensive in Canada for some of the same reasons cell phone and grocery bills are high. There's a need for greater competition. Air Canada and WestJet dominate the market, and it's expensive for airlines to service communities across Canada. Routes between major Canadian hubs are unlikely to see the same volume of flyers as routes in Europe and the US. There's another reason Canadians pay a lot for flights: airport fees. Simply put, it's more costly for airlines to operate in Canada than other countries, and those costs get passed down to consumers. The Liberal Party's approval ratings are at an all-time low since 2015, as is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's personal approval ratings since coming to power. How is the government trying to deal with the problems mentioned above? As for the problem of high housing prices and lack of supply on the housing market, Immigration Minister Mark Miller says the federal government is looking at a number of options to re-evaluate permanent resident levels in Canada and says any upcoming changes will not be cosmetic. Earlier, the federal government announced stricter rules to reduce the low-wage stream of temporary foreign workers after a surge in recent years to address the post-pandemic labor shortage. Justin Trudeau also signaled more immigration changes will come this autumn for permanent residents. A possible reduction in permanent resident levels could mark a major policy reversal for the Trudeau government. Last November, the federal government announced it was freezing permanent resident targets over the next 3 years to ensure sustainability. There is an aim to bring in 485,000 permanent residents in 2024 and 500,000 in both 2025 and 2026. Those projected numbers are a more than 50% increase from the 296,000 permanent residents welcomed in 2016. Back in January, Miller announced a 2-year cap on the number of permits for international students. This year, the government will approve about 360,000 undergraduate study permits, a 35% reduction from the nearly 560,000 issued in 2023. The government recently published a plan for how the government is going to deal with the housing crisis. The plan is to build 3.9 million homes by 2031. One of the main ways the Liberals say they will build more homes is by lowering the cost of construction and making it easier to produce housing. To that end, the plan includes a number of tax and policy reforms as well as loans to incentivize builders to undertake new projects. Another way to build more homes is to launch a public lands for homes strategy, in which surplus and vacant federal government land across Canada would be used to build new homes or communities. The plan also includes making it easier to own or rent a home, as well as helping Canadians who can't afford housing. It is obvious that the problem of housing costs is complex and cannot be solved in the next few years. We will see if the government can do something to improve the situation. For now, we probably should not expect the same dramatic changes that have come to the housing market in China. I have a video about the state of the Chinese economy and the catastrophic consequences of the collapse of the real estate market for many companies and people. For a long time, no changes in antitrust law were expected, but now Canada is slowly closing the gap with the US and Europe in this area. On September 2023, the Industry, Science and Economic Development Minister François-Philippe Champagne announced several key changes the government will be making to the Competition Act. Key fixes Champagne promised include: 1. Removing the so-called efficiencies defense, which enables anti-competitive mergers if the companies successfully argue they'll improve productivity, and 2. Giving the Competition Bureau, Canada's key competition regulator, more power to study markets and make recommendations about improving industry competition. Obviously, all the changes that the government will be able to make will most likely be gradual. Big companies against which restrictions are directed will resist and defend their interests, including through politicians loyal to the management of mega corporations. But significant changes in antitrust laws will not only reduce prices and increase the variety of goods on the market, but also promote competition in the labor market, which has a better impact on the conditions of workers. Also, competition spurs the development of various technologies and stimulates invention, which of course in the long run can affect the entire economy for the better.